foregoing has defined the nature of the activity of skepticism as such, and the way in which it operates. It exhibits the dialectical movement which sense certainty, perception, and the understanding each is, as also the unessential character of what, in the relationship of lord and bondsman, and for abstract thinking itself, is held to be a determinate element. That relationship at the same time embraces a specific mode in which ethical laws too are present as sovereign commands. The determinations in abstract thinking, however, are scientific notions in which formal, contentless thinking spreads itself, attaching the notion, in fact, in a merely external way to the being constituting its content, and which for it is independent and holding as valid only determinate notions, even though these are only pure abstractions. Paragraph 203 is, in many respects, kind of a retrospective. It's connecting up this section on skepticism to what has come before. Not what immediately preceded it, which is what 202 did, connecting it with Stoicism, but now with the whole of consciousness, that early section, and also with the master-slave dialectic and what the upshot is from that. We're going to see this continued in 204, where Hegel is going to tell us about why all of this dialectical development mattered so much and how it feeds into skepticism. So let's see first how that fits in. Before that, he does say the foregoing is define the nature of the activity of skepticism as such and the way in which it operates. Okay, that's paragraph 202. That's saying, here's what we understand of skepticism so far. Good enough, right. Then he says it exhibits the dialectical movement which sense certainty, perception, and the understanding each is. So when we were going through these earlier sections in consciousness, when we're going through the first part of the work, where it almost seems like, given those and given the introduction and perhaps the preface, what we're grappling with here is a work in epistemology, perhaps, or the genesis of our ideas, or, we're not quite sure what we're doing. And then there's going to be this transition to this other section that seems a little arbitrary, doesn't it? Why did we go through all of that? Why bother, plotting out how we begin with the immediate, and then find out that it's not quite so immediate, that what we intend and what we use language for aren't, exactly the same, and we can distinguish this aspect and all that. And then going into perception, the grasping of the truth of something, why do we need to go through all of that? Well, you could say, sense certainty culminates in perception, and perception culminates in the understanding, and the understanding culminates in self-consciousness, so that's the whole point of it. That's not all that's going on there, though. What we've learned by looking at the dialectical movements is not to place all of our eggs in any particular epistemological or metaphysical basket, to use a metaphor, right? Or to say it in another way, we've learned that no particular stopping off point is the end of the dialectic. You can always go further with it. And it may turn out that it's not a simple, straightforward progression, although we have to set it out like that in linear form in the text. It could be that it can meander around different ways, but it ends up in the same place, so that what we take to be sense certainty through a variety of different tropes doesn't turn out to be sense certainty at all. Or what we think to be perception has a lot more going on in it, right? There's a possibility of a greater freedom, a greater play in this that is involved in the dialectic. And so skepticism exploits that. We also see in the relationship between master and slave, as he's going to point out here, he says, the unessential character of what in the relationship of lord and bondsman, and for abstract thinking itself, Stoicism, is held to be a determinate element, right? So what in this power relation, structuring human society, structuring the development of human consciousness, because remember the slave encountering fear that shakes him to the foundations, and by being put to service by the master and doing work, externalizing himself into work, becomes fully self-conscious. Skepticism shows, like it says, the unessential character of the determinate element. So the master as master, in many respects, doesn't really matter as such. Certainly not in the master as being Jim, who lives in that house up there and has all of these slaves performing this particular labor for him. Stoicism corrodes that. The freedom of saying, no, that's not that important. It shows the unessentiality of it. Is that all there is to the master-slave dialectic? Well, no. There was something going on there, just as there was something going on here, learning about the whole dialectical movement and what it means, that we didn't grasp in that section. So he says that relationship at the same time embraces a specific mode in which ethical laws too are present as sovereign commands. This is going to be important. This is going to emerge many times in the course of the phenomenology, this focus on the ethical sphere. With the master and slave, the mere power relation by itself is rather arbitrary. You could, we do this thing with movies like Trading Places, right? Now that's not a master-slave relationship, but a class relationship. But you can do that where you switch them around and you say, aha, now you're the slave. I get to be the master. And we find out just how arbitrary and how unessential these power relations turn out to be in many respects. But this is not quite so arbitrary, it seems. There are ethical laws that come down. The master performs a function that is not merely that of dominating and enjoying and putting to work. The master also provides a kind of ethics or morality, a set of norms that are being presented as a sovereign command. As a matter of fact, when we look at societies that are at this sort of level, it's not usually one given master who does that. It usually turns out to be the master, like the gods or somebody like that, who's giving these. And then the question that we're dealing with here, that's left undetermined in this passage, but we're going to see addressed very soon. Well, what do we make of this? We've realized that this contained all sorts of really interesting stuff, but the dialectical movements from a skeptical perspective showed us that we can't trust any of it, perhaps not even the conclusions, because the conclusions feed into other ones. We found that the master-slave dialectic also has, these unessential character to the determinate elements. So it's rather arbitrary as well. We can by being skeptics, sort of tear it down, although we're not actually affecting the power structure by doing so. What about this? Does this escape the scope of the skeptic? That's the question that we want to move into. Now, Hegel is also saying another thing about what's going on in skepticism. He says that the determinations in abstract thinking are scientific notions, in which, here's the structure, there's not that much going on here, formal, contentless thinking that is just sort of a schema, let's say, spreads itself, attaching to the notion, in fact, in a merely external way to the being constituting its content. So it says, all right, this kind of being over here, here's the idea for it, here's the notion. It's doing so, like he says, in an external way. This is similar to the schematism that Hegel was criticizing earlier on in the preface. He says, which for it is independent and holding as valid only determinate notions, even though these are only pure abstractions. This is not really that important at this point to think about, but what the skeptic is doing in a positive way is trying to reconstitute things. And so we'll see if that actually turns out to be a real-life possibility for them, or whether it's a sterile exercise. Dialectic as a negative movement, just as it immediately is, at first appears to consciousness as something which has it at its mercy, and which does not have its source in consciousness itself. As skepticism, on the other hand, it is a moment of self-consciousness to which it does not happen that its truth and reality vanish without its knowing how, but which, in the certainty of its freedom, makes this other which claims to be real vanish. What skepticism causes to vanish is not only objective reality as such, but its own relationship to it, in which the other is held to be objective and is established as such, and hence, too, its perceiving along with firmly securing what it is in danger of losing, that is, sophistry, and the truth it has itself determined and established. Through this self-conscious negation, it procures for its own self the certainty of its freedom, generates the experience of that freedom, and thereby raises it to truth. What vanishes is the determinate element, or the moment of difference, which, whatever its mode of being and whatever its source, sets itself up as something fixed and immutable. It contains no permanent element and must vanish before thought, because the different is just this, not to be in possession of itself, but to have its essential being only in another. Thinking, however, is the insight into this nature of the different. It is the negative essence as simple. We've already explored, in part, the nature and the workings of skepticism in the two previous paragraphs. Now in 204, we're going to see how skepticism functions as a type of agency, which it wasn't realized to be at first. It's a realization on the part of consciousness of just what consciousness can do as the negative. So actually, let me put this here for a moment. So I'm going to be adding a lot to the board as we plow through this. Hegel starts out this paragraph by saying that dialectic as a negative movement, right? Dialectic says, well, no, there's more to the story. Let's also look at this. There's, what we call determinate negation, where we don't just say, no, that's not it. We say, well, that's not it because this is also going on, and this and this and this, and now we have to adopt this perspective over here. There's this constant shift back and forth. So dialectic is a negative movement, just as it immediately is. Right? Whenever we see immediacy, what are we supposed to do? Look out for some shift that's going to take place. At first appears to consciousness as something which has it at its mercy, and which does not have its source in consciousness itself. So the skeptic, as the zetoi, the seeker, the one who wants to grasp the world, the other, truth, reality, these things over here, dialectic may seem as if it's a way to arrive at it, but then it becomes something like a gatekeeper, or like a thief who takes these things away. And what happens is consciousness is reaching out through dialectic to try to grasp the world, and dialectic turns everything on its head and says, nope, you don't get it. It's sort of like going into, a machine, and you're supposed to arrive at some great, thing that you've been desiring so badly, and it plops you down right where you started, right? And that's what happens. Consciousness then has the opportunity to stop itself and to remain in a kind of skepticism that will go nowhere. To say, see, we can't really arrive at anything. We can't know anything at all. Oh, that's so terrible. And that's what happens with some skeptics. That's not what happens with skepticism itself. And that's not why it's an important shape of consciousness. Hegel goes on and he says, as skepticism there's a realization on the part of consciousness that takes place. It's a moment of self-consciousness to which it does not happen that its truth and reality vanish without its knowing how. Somewhere over here, like in a castle or a prison, warded off by dialectic. Rather, it says, in the certainty of its freedom, skepticism makes this other which claims to be real vanish. skepticism is undermining this. He says, what skepticism causes to vanish is not only objective reality as such, not only this over here, but also its own relation to it. Dialectic turns out to have its negativity only because consciousness is the negative which employs the dialectic, which unfolds the dialectic. The dialectic is something for consciousness. Consciousness is not at its mercy. Consciousness is grasping things through the dialectic. So he says, this relation to the other, as well as the other, is caused to vanish. This relationship in which the other is held to be objective and is established as such. And hence, too, it's perceiving, along with firmly securing what it is in danger of losing, that is, sophistry. So perception is being called into question through dialectic, like we saw, right? In sense perception, in the sense certainty, and in the understanding. We're never really grasping what we appear to be wholly grasping. There's always much more going on, and it's consciousness that through dialectic can become aware of it. There isn't any independent reality over here totally away from consciousness and the dialectic that it is using as its tool. It's also in danger of losing sophistry. That doesn't sound like such a bad thing, right? He says, hence too, it's perceiving along with firmly securing what it is in danger of losing, sophistry, and the truth it has itself determined and established. So here's where we get to the part of skepticism where it starts to also turn inward on itself. He says, through this self-conscious negation, it procures for its own self the certainty of its freedom. By employing the dialectic, self-consciousness realizes that it can, in fact, negate anything. It can always take another perspective, because there are other perspectives there to grasp. It just has to make explicit what is implicitly there in the logic of the dialectic with respect to anything else. But it can also turn this in upon itself. It can turn this on skepticism itself as a mode of being, as a mode of acting. So he says, through this self-conscious negation, it procures for its own self the certainty of its freedom, generates the experience of that freedom. It's by engaging in dialectical examination of things that we realize what our freedom is. We have options. We can look at things this way, or we can look at them this way. We're also, in a certain sense, unfree. And we're going to talk about that in a moment as well. And I just want to plant the seed for that, because part of what we want in our freedom is to arrive at truth and self-certainty, right? But that's something yet to come. So he says, we thereby raise our certainty, our freedom, to truth. So what is vanishing? The determinate element, or the moment of difference, which, whatever its mode of being and whatever its source, set itself up as something fixed and immutable. Everything becomes subject to dialectic because it is subject to consciousness. So everything becomes unfixed. That doesn't mean that everything is totally in flux. That's not our experience of the world. But for the skeptic, anything could be different than it is. There is radical contingency running through everything. We can see that the skeptic in this sense is really like, say, David Hume, Or, to pick a later philosopher who has a lot of affinities with that, and who's also an existentialist, Lev Shestov. These sorts of realizations of radical contingency, that things could indeed be otherwise, and most likely will indeed, give it enough time or shift the vantage point, will indeed be otherwise, including everything that I take to be myself, my consciousness. For my consciousness to be negative, for it also to be freedom, means that it cannot remain what it is in any sort of fixed way forever. The dialectic turns inward on the subject himself as well as against the world. So he says, there's nothing that sets itself up as something fixed and immutable. It contains no permanent element and must vanish before thought. Because the different is just this, not to be in possession of itself, but to have its essential being only in an other. What he's calling the different there is, let's give that a little bit of room here. Difference is relation. If you think back to Aristotle's categories, if you're familiar with those, Aristotle wanted to base everything ultimately on substance. For Hegel, that's not really going to be a possibility in the way that Aristotle envisioned it. One of the categories that Aristotle had was the pros ti, or what we translate as relation. Literally, pros ti means in conjunction or in connection with or in relation to something else. So I am a son, pros, my father, right? I am a son by relation to my father, and this jacket is mine by being made mine. There's all sorts of other relations. The light is shining on me in a certain way, and there's other categories that we could apply, like the light is doing an active thing, I'm experiencing a passion. Aristotle would say, this is very technical, we don't need to get into all this, but this relationship, this relationality is quite important. Difference is revealed as relation and always sort of subject to being revised, he says. The different is just this, not to be in possession of itself, but to have its essential being only in another. Thinking, he says, is the insight into this nature of the difference. It is the negative essence as simple. So when we arrive at the point where we realize the radical contingency, the fact that anything can be arranged by the dialectic in relation to something else, that we can open our viewpoint up further, that we can collapse it and zone in on just this, that lies within the scope of our freedom in using our capacities of thought, everything becomes, at this stage, unmoored. There's nothing that can be totally relied upon as essential, except the thinking itself. Thinking is the essentiality. Again, think back to just 2 paragraphs before. Skepticism is the realization of that of which Stoicism was only the notion. Here is where we see it really being carried out, and in the next paragraph, we're going to see how it falls apart.